Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 1st, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing and John Hogoboom. I'm Brian Rexroad, and first topic we're going to talk about today is a article I ran across. It's basically the headline here is China's unsupported XP machines hold the potential to become a massive botnet army. And I thought that was kind of sort of a provocative or sort of headline. Took a look at the article, and really what it's talking about is the fact that XP being having been around for about 12 years now, Microsoft is no longer going to be supporting Windows XP, and there's been a reasonable amount of campaign, in fact, discount programs to help incentivize organizations to update to newer versions of Windows. And this is a particular case where basically the article is claiming that because those Windows XP machines are still going to be out there, they're going to be a potential hotbed for exploitation in the future. You know, I'm not sure I agree with this, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Jim and John. You know, it seems to me that if the bugs are, you know, for the most part, particularly in an operating system that's been around for 12 years, that if you're going to find a bug, they've probably been pretty much found at this point. And, you know, considering most of the world is, in fact, around, has been updated, it seems like the attackers and the exploiters would tend to be, you know, even the white hatters would be focused more on the new operating systems. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so, you know, my thought on this is that there is a little bit of difference, perhaps, in the XP machines in China from reading this article than there are in other parts of the world. And, you know, Steve Ballmer from Microsoft had quoted some time ago, maybe 2 years or something ago, that 90% of the Microsoft software used in China, including Windows XP, was pirated. So one of the side effects of using pirated software is that you don't get updates. So they could be running, you know, there could be a large number of machines over in China that are running the stock Windows XP from the CD with no updates whatsoever on there. So that might be another reason why they're more vulnerable than, you know, say a XP machine that's over here that maybe have gotten updates over the course of the past 12 years or so.
Oh, absolutely. So that would be perhaps a different perspective, that it's not as if there's really anything fundamentally changing about the potential vulnerability of these machines. They may have been sitting vulnerable for as long as they've lasted.
Yeah, that's one possibility. And the other thing is, you know, some of the software, you know, is still the same, and the big thing that's going to change on April 8th is that XP is no longer going to get any patches. So even if they do patch software, you know, that runs on all versions of Windows, they're not going to provide the patches for XP. That's why, you know, it concerns me with the number of like point-of-sale terminals that are still running XP. XP, I suspect there's going to be some folks who are going to continue to have to run XP for whatever reason for a while now, and I really believe that those machines ought to be, you know, completely walled off from everything else to the extent possible, because whatever vulnerabilities are there, most of them may very well have been found, but, you know, whatever new ones are found will never get fixed. So.
Well, I think you actually bring up, or at least touched on what I think is a good point, Jim, in that, you know, in some of the articles I've seen, I happen to recall a television program that was or news report that was addressing the expiration of XP in terms of support, and they were actually pointing to ATMs as being a large user of, you know, it's effectively an embedded system using XP. And very hard to retrofit. That is, they're not really set up to be updated frequently. But that is one case that is a very controlled interface. It's you know, you have specific things that you can do from the screen. If anybody's going to actually do anything with the software itself, it's a matter of actually, you know, unlocking the box and going in and doing something. We've certainly heard of cases where the attackers have figured out exactly where to drill a hole and drilling a hole so they can get to the USB port and do their thing with it. But that's perhaps even sort of another sort of scenario where perhaps it's not as critical that XP be updated because it is very much a controlled interface. Your point's well taken. Anyway, I think it's useful to consider stories like this and how they fit into the grand scheme of things, because there are certainly a variety of different circumstances that determine what the implications are. I don't think there's going to be a big change just because of the end of the support here. I think a lot of the vulnerabilities that exist are going to be there. But Jim, you do make a good point that sometimes we've seen a number of cases like this before, where a new vulnerability is discovered in what they thought was a new version of software, and then when you go back and look at it, it turns out that's been in existence of a lot of previous versions as well. So in that particular certain circumstance especially, XP won't be getting the updates, whereas newer versions will be. So we hope it doesn't turn into a big problem, but it is certainly something to be aware of. Anybody that's using XP should be making a push to get away from it. So let's move on here. John, DNS has been used in a variety of different attacks here, and this looks like there's actually an additional or new twist to this particular case, huh?
Yeah, there's a story, actually Fish Labs came out with this story last week, and I thought it was interesting because we've discussed this before about rogue DNS servers out there. DNS Changer is one that's pretty infamous, that there was a big takedown operation around. And the basic gist of what a lot of these malware do is they will either modify on the local machine the DNS server settings to point to a rogue DNS server, such that when you try to get to whatever, Windows Update.Microsoft.com or something, they give a fake answer back so you don't get your updates, or maybe you get wrong updates, things like that. Anyway, so they use these rogue DNS servers to provide false answers, or even to, give you other things for click fraud and things like that. They can inject things into your browser session by sending you to different places. And they do that either locally or on your home router. We've seen a lot of them that impact the home router as well. Anyway, more to the point of this particular story, there's a slight twist on this one. There's another same thing that we always know, these man-in-the-middle attacks. Malware gets on the machine, updates the DNS settings on the local machine. But an additional thing that they did here in this one is, let me see if I have a slide here for it. Well, here's a little example of what happens. Normal process, you ask a trustworthy DNS server on the left-hand side of the screen here. It gives you an answer back for the IP address, and you go to that banking website, and you get the right, you get connected to the right place. With the rogue DNS, the infected PC goes to look up the DNS setting for some bank, and it gets an answer back from the rogue DNS server that says, hey, it's right over here at me, and then you basically connect back to that one, or your browser does, and now they can kind of act in the middle of that transaction and proxy your transaction between their infrastructure here in red and the actual bank. So they kind of act in the middle, and they will kind of proxy your traffic. The one thing about that is traditionally, even though they kind of lie about where the DNS resolves for a particular bank, in your browser you should get some kind of warning that says, hey, you've got an SSL certificate here that is signed as such and such bank, but it's not signed properly by a trusted certificate authority. So that has kind of traditionally been a way that, we talk about all the time. If you see a broken SSL certificate or it gives you a warning, you might want to stop and think twice.
Or no SSL.
What's that?
Or no SSL.
Or no SSL, right. That's the other case. In this case, what they did, a little additional twist to maybe increase their success, is as part of the malware, in addition to changing the DNS settings on the local machine, they inject their own certificate authority. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, I show, if you look in your browser, Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, whatever you have, there's usually a section that you can go look at and see what all the trusted root certification authorities are. And these are signers that will sign the SSL certificates for various people. And they do some vetting to make sure that whoever they're going to sign a certificate for is really a trusted entity and whatnot. So what they've done here, the attacker, is they basically made up a rogue CA certificate, root certificate, and they inject it into the browsers so that now when you go to their rogue proxy server that is at their address that they gave you with their fake DNS response, you're going to get a certificate back because you're talking to their proxy server at that point via HTTPS. And it's going to be signed via that certificate authority, but your browser is going to trust it now, and it's not going to show a warning, and it'll look, authenticated, fine, and whatnot, and then you'll probably continue along here. So this is pretty devious in my mind that they got kind of clever or crafty with this one in that they're smarter than what they had been doing, and even someone like myself, if I'm not, first of all, it's hard to know when your DNS is being tampered with because you don't really have good visibility into it unless you're really poking around with it. And this makes it even more tricky in that now you can't really trust your HTTPS certificate trusted lock on your browser that you're really talking to a trustworthy entity that's signed properly and everything.
Mm-hmm. It's curious because I think we went through sort of almost a fad or phase last year where there were a lot of certificate authorities that were having certificates either fraudulently created or some other sort of penetration or stolen in effect, the signing key stolen. And
right.
Now it seems like, well, why bother with that? We can inject our own trusted certificate authority into infected machines and go from there. We don't need to go through all that trouble. So, just another sort of troubling aspect that it's fundamentally impossible. I mean, really fundamentally impossible to trust something that has potentially been compromised. So long as our end client machines have the potential to be compromised, you really can't trust them to be telling you the truth about what you're doing.
Right. The interesting thing to me in my mind also when I was reading this is, okay, if you've already got malware that you can place on the machine, they could have put some type of man-in-the-browser type of malware on there that would kind of negate this anyway. They could just let them talk to the real website and have something that's actually watching the entire browser session. Since they're local to the machine, they should have pretty good visibility in that. And Zeus and some of these other crimeware toolkits do that anyway.
As often as done, yes.
But this one, even if they clean up the malware, unless they fix the DNS settings on the machine and get rid of this rogue CA certificate in there, it'll still work. So it's kind of got a little bit of bulletproofing from being cleaned up by an AV vendor, or at least the malware executable getting detected and cleaned up. It still should allow the attacker to leverage that vector.
Yep, absolutely. It's something that we're going to want to be taking a look at. Now, in an enterprise environment, I think one of the things that you want to be able to or make sure that you're enforcing as a part of the enterprise is that users are restricted to using the authoritative or the accepted DNS service that's associated with your enterprise. And that will help to avert this problem or the potential of a problem with a DNS changer type malware affecting the enterprise machines. That does not help necessarily when you get out onto the internet, but for the most part, I think it would pretty much help with an enterprise environment. For the home environment, you really have to pay a little more closer attention, or perhaps even include some rules in your firewall that prevent, in your router to prevent using other than your local DNS service. But that can be a little bit tricky to do.
Right.
And I'm wondering, are there any do any of the browsers or the OSs alert you when a new root CA has been installed into that key store? I'm thinking they don't, but that would also be something that we could figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
Alert on that.
Yeah. Clearly, that's something that would be restricted to administrator privileges. It's certainly a changing registry, and I would expect that you would get some sort of a prompt associated with that. But a large number of users, use their machines as with administrator privileges, and I think that's one of the fundamental weaknesses that we have. That doesn't necessarily prevent malware from getting privilege escalation. A lot of these, a lot of the malware actually has that capability inherently with it anyway. But
right.
You're absolutely right. That is a potential control that could be put into place to help.
Yeah, and then just one last thing. Well, first of all, I think it's good to make people aware that this tactic's in play, because I wasn't aware of it prior to this, and it's pretty crafty. But the last thing I wanted to leave people with or mention is that this is kind of what they've been seeing as a delivery mechanism here. So it's been getting spammed out. So this is actually happening out in the real world right now, and it's basically being delivered through spam that has an email message with a rich text format document. I just want to clarify. This is not it's not exploiting the RTF exploit that was kind of publicized last week. As far as I can tell, it's not.
So this isn't exploiting Word, the vulnerability in Word. Is that what you mean by that?
Right. No, it's not doing that. It's basically an RTF document, and then inside there they've embedded an OLE object, which is actually an executable program. So you can kind of see on the side here, they've got this authorization form, and it's got like a little notepad type of logo or icon on it, and if you actually click that, that's actually an executable that's, put into the RTF document, and you would have to double-click that and run it, and then your machine would become infected.
A clever name, authorization form, as if it's giving them permission to do this to your machine.
But that's about it. I guess it's just one of those things to be wary of, either in your enterprise or at home as well.
Yep, absolutely. So a little more work to do on your home machine to protect against something like this. And in the enterprise environment, like I said, so long as you're restricting what DNS services that users can go to, it at least is an inhibitor or an indicator. You're probably going to see it as a network problem than a security problem in the end. All right, good. Thanks, John. That's actually a very, I feel to be a very informative story there. Next one here, we talk a lot about scanning activity, and Jim, we've talked a little bit about the port 5000 scanning. I think it sounds like you have an update here.
Yeah, we've been talking about this port 5000 scanning for probably a month now or more. And Johannes Ulrich over at the Internet Storm Center has actually managed to get his hands on some of the malware and done a little bit of analysis on it. And we've talked a number of times that a lot of the machines doing this appear to be those security surveillance camera DVRs. And as I said, Johannes managed to get his hands on some of the malware and did some analysis on it. And it's an ARM binary that takes the info that it gets the DVR gathers when it's doing the scanning about the various machines that respond on port 5000 and sends that information back to a central server. So there's somebody out there that's collecting a whole lot of this information. But he also noticed that a lot of these DVRs that were compromised also appear to have a couple of other malicious packages running on there, a Bitcoin miner and another tool that could possibly be used for doing secondary payload downloads. He also discovered that what appears to be the same binary or a very similar binary is also showing up on a number of Wi-Fi broadband routers. So I've got the binary. I haven't really had a lot of time yet to look at it myself, but Johannes has done a pretty good write-up over there. So just some new developments in this thing that we've been watching go on for weeks now.
Yep, absolutely. It's thanks for that, Jim. It's interesting. I guess not a surprise. He recognized that a lot of this activity is on security surveillance camera DVRs, as we've been reporting for some time as well. The Bitcoin miner thing is kind of interesting. I thought maybe that would be becoming a little bit passé, considering that Bitcoin, I guess they're still worth around $470 a Bitcoin, and so it's probably, I guess, still worthwhile. But it certainly has dropped in value since some of these other potential, in fact, some potential fraud associated with Bitcoin service providers have popped up.
Yeah, and Johannes said what we've long suspected, that it looks like a lot of these DVRs were compromised via Telnet with a really, really poor default password.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if I remember correctly, John, you had investigated this some time ago. If I remember correctly, the documentation for the device doesn't even really identify the fact that default password is there. Is that correct?
I don't know if I remember that. I did investigate some of this way back. I want to say sometime late last year, before the 5000 stuff cropped up, and I had observed that there was a malware payload being deployed on these that was based on the Light Hydra malware family, which is a ARM binary that it's basically a toolkit that's available out there on the internet. And but you're right. I can confirm basically what Jim said. Most of these do not have a very good password. It's a default kind of password that comes with it. I think more often than not, the problem is users just aren't aware of the fact that when they poke a hole in their firewall or whatnot to allow these devices to be accessed from the internet, that anybody in the world is going to be looking for it. I think there might be some naivety there, and that's why they don't even think to change the password.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think, and don't take my word for it. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but it was my understanding that some of these leave port 23 open, Telnet open, and that's not even identified in the documentation. There's a root password associated with that. I think your point's well taken in terms of exposing the web interface is yet another aspect of it that provides an avenue for exploiting a lot of these devices or getting control of it.
Right.
Okay, so let's, I guess the next and last story I wanted to share with you here is what I would classify as good ideas. RFCs have an expiration date associated with them. They're only around for a certain amount of time, and then they expire. But good ideas actually have no expiration date, and this is one that Steve Bellevin had recommended some time ago that never really got traction. It's one where he suggested a security flag in the IPv4 header, and the idea here is that it would make it much easier for firewalls and IDSs and other systems to be able to identify malicious packets if there was simply a bit in there that would tell you the packets that were considered malicious and which ones you can consider to be safe packets. Now, like I said, it seems like a really good idea here, and I guess in the spirit of April 1st, I wanted to just share that one with you here. This was actually published by Steve Bellevin on the 1st of April in 2003, so I guess we're in our 11th year anniversary of that, what I, again, think was a very good idea. So with that, let's move on and take a little bit of a look at the Internet Weather Report in a more practical sense. And there are no malicious bits identified in these packets, but they certainly have some indicators that they have no good intent in mind. This happens to be byte volume on destination port 53 UDP. That's DNS. I'm showing 30 days of activity here, and these are what I would describe as a variety of DNS flooding attacks. So this is denial of service attacks taking place. Usually these tend to be targeting DNS servers as a means to disrupt service for end users. And what we're seeing here, as I said, a number of them. There have been over the last couple of weeks some. And just to sort of point out a characteristic in some of these attacks, one, we'll take a look at this particular one here. Let me pick another color just to make this so it will show up a little bit better. We see actually a spiking activity where the attack activity peaks out, and then if you look closely, you can see sort of a decay end that attack activity. Typically, as in scanning activity, that is an indicator of activity that basically, as the botnet is performing its flooding attack, over time, some of the bots will complete sending its activity and then basically stop, and you'll see a decay in that activity over time. It could also have something to do with a mitigation activity that might be taking place to take that botnet out of service, for example, or to block IP addresses, but you see that decay of activity taking place. The fact that we're seeing this repeatedly, sort of a sawtooth effect on a lot of these attacks, indicates that perhaps what they're saying to each of these bots is a very simple sort of attack strategy to basically say, throw this many packets at a target and then stop sending the packets. And so some of them do it more quickly than others, and you see that decay pattern in the attack activity. This could quite possibly be due to maybe they have constraints in the size of the software that they can put on their devices that have been compromised to facilitate these attacks, or something along those lines. Next item here, we reported on this last week, and we're continuing to keep an eye on it, but basically I think this is really innocuous activity. This is scan sources on port 28017 UDP, and all of the indications that we've seen so far is that this looks like basically peer-to-peer gaming activity. The port is associated with an application, MongoDB, which is a database application, but in this particular case, like I said, it looks like it's peer-to-peer activity associated with gaming and is completely innocuous. Perhaps a gaming provider came out with a new application, and they are ramping up pretty rapidly in terms of users, so good for them. Next item here is scan probes on port 808 TCP, and this is commonly associated with or at least had been commonly associated with an application called CC Proxy. John, you had mentioned something of having used that in the past. And it may, in fact, also be associated with Microsoft Exchange. That is, in some of the research that I had done here, I'd seen some commentary or discussion around the possibility that Microsoft Exchange could be using port 808 TCP in some capacity. And then last but not least, there are traditionally some Trojans that are readily recognized as having used port 808 TCP as well. I'm not sure which of these is being looked for, but we are seeing a number of probes, most of the probes in this case from China, and there are also some probes from other countries as well, but for the most part, that is the most voluminous portion. And I think what kind of triggered the interest here is this sort of block of activity that had taken place just a few days ago, which would lead it into this report, although it's clear that there are sort of spikes in activity in terms of scanning activity on this port from time to time. And the next item here, we see bytes on source port 161 UDP. This is a simple network management protocol, and this is clearly reflection attacks. Reflection attacks that are using SNMP as the reflection mechanism, and the targets that we're seeing here are, we've seen a combination of consumer targets and mobility targets. So not your typical enterprise environment that we generally associate with denial of service attacks. Now, I bring this up partly because we are seeing an increase in not so much in the size of the attacks here, but certainly in the density of attacks. That we're seeing SNMP being used in these attacks much more frequently. It was just a spike or two we saw back on March 11th here. We started to see a handful of them around the middle of March and the 17th time frame, and we're almost seeing continuous activity since about the 25th of March here. So over the last week or so, it's gotten much more dense in terms of the amount of activity we're seeing using this port for attack activity. Considering we're seeing this, I wanted to put this a little bit more into perspective. So we'll do a little bit of a comparative analysis, and this was looking back over the last 120 days. And as you can see here, we have a number of different ports represented, each with a different color here. This yellow is NTP, Network Time Protocol. The green represents character generator, that's port 19 UDP. The red represents DNS, port 53 UDP, and it's very difficult to see here, but we also have SNMP that's showing up in here, and that's in dark blue. So with the combination of these, you can start to see, you can really see the perspective that is which of these ports are really causing the most impact from a denial of service attack point of view. So first of all, what we have seen, actually this was a surprise to me, is the amount of activity that we've been seeing related to port 19 UDP. There's a source port 19 UDP, that's character generator, and I was surprised to see that there is actually a reasonable amount of attack traffic using that port on a fairly regular basis, and that was kind of neck and neck in terms of volume with DNS reflection attack activity that we've been seeing on the network. And then obviously around the third week in December, we started to really see the NTP activity ramp up, and that got well up. In fact, I've clipped off the top of the graph here, but that really ramped up into what I would describe as large attacks, up in the tens of gigabits per second in many of these cases. It's also interesting to observe, and actually important to observe, the density of these attacks. That is, when I say density, I'm talking about frequency, the fact that they are basically continuing to take place with little breaks in between. Now, we definitely saw a lull in the volume of NTP attacks. I'm not sure I have a complete explanation for that, but it's interesting to see that when that lull took place, there seemed to be a surge or a growth in activity using DNS and perhaps character generator as well. So there was an up and a down, and we saw a downward trend in the use of DNS and reflection attack activity here, whereas the attack and the NTP volume went up significantly. So that was right around the time when the monlist command was discovered in a broader sense in the public domain, and it started to be used prolifically in attack activity. And since then, what we've seen is, I think, an effort to repair that problem across the internet, and so we're seeing the NTP attack activity going down, more sparseness in the significant attacks. And it's a little bit subtle here, but it seems like a little bit of a pickup in the DNS activity, and certainly a pickup in the SNMP activity, but the SNMP activity still way, way, way down in the noise, relatively speaking, in terms of the size of attacks that are taking place. And thank you for coloring that in a color that actually contrasts with red. So with that, certainly NTP is still the one to be paying most attention to if you're concerned about reflection attacks. And some of these other attacks certainly are in there, and let's be on the watch out for sort of a resurgence or a growth in abuses of DNS. DNS is the trickier one to control here because DNS does require a lot of servers on the internet, and there are a number of nuances that can be taken advantage of for these denial of service attacks. So putting some, not just minimizing the open DNS servers on the internet, but putting controls in place to recognize abuses of DNS servers is probably going to be imperative as we progress forward. Next item here is the top 10 most probed ports, and at the top of the list this week we have port 22 TCP, and that's apparently associated with a lot of these embedded systems. Now, in this particular case, most of these sources and most of the probes were actually originated from China, but it's most likely associated with password guessing attacks, perhaps looking for default passwords and such. Next in line, the port 5000 TCP that Jim was just telling us about, port 23 TCP, port 80 TCP, port 445, 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, then port 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database, and then one that we see pop up from time to time, port 25 TCP, perhaps looking for open email resolvers that could be used for spamming operations or possibly penetration attacks. And then last but not least here, port 443 TCP, which would be looking for web servers that would be potentially exploitable. Next item here is the most sources doing the probing, top 10 sources, and this is from March 31st. And we see at the top of the list here, actually port 445 that we typically see, port 23 following that. port 5000, as we talked about, and then we also see the P2P ports associated with zero access botnet that's since been the command and control disabled in that. And then last but not least, port 80 TCP. That's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us through email at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can get in touch with us also through Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq, as well as the AT&T Tech channel on YouTube. And there's also an audio-only version on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, John, for joining. And we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.